Okay, so we are live with a few technical difficulties. Welcome, Ken Pope. You are our bonus April Liberal Values Lab. The reason we are doing this bonus this time is because internally with the Institute for Liberal Values, we've got a lot of questions around Ukraine. And thankfully, Ken Pope, as our advisor, is a senior fellow, at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and has been given this talk on Ukraine frequently. So we had a podcast. I'll put that also in our show notes with Ken, and he answered a lot of our questions, a lot of our what we considered our kind of dumb questions, if you will. I will put that podcast in our show notes for this YouTube. For our listeners, we want you to be a part of this conversation. So if you are on YouTube or IL Values YouTube or X, please feel free to type in your questions into the notes and we will get to them as they go along. Ken's got a presentation here that we're having some fun trying to get up right now. Ken, I'm going to let you, as I think that this is processing, I'm going to let you give a little introduction to yourself and how you, so that people know how you've got the authority to talk about Ukraine, and hopefully by then we will have processed some of your slide decks and we can get this going.
Okay, well, I think I can probably drive it from my end doing the thing we talked about earlier. But let me just give you a little bit about my background on this topic. So as Jim mentioned, we talked about it a little bit on a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and we thought we'd do it again because we had a good deal of fun talking about it. It's a serious topic, but it's very interesting too. So my background on this. So my background on this topic of Russia, the Soviet Union, and this particular war goes back, I guess, all the way back to my university days during the Cold War, where I studied. My undergrad degree was sociology of the Soviet Union. My grad degree was, I did my master's thesis on Soviet and Russian imperialism, modern imperialism in the Caucasus. So I've got some background on that. I did 23 years in the military as an Army officer. Most of that was focused on as an armored reconnaissance officer first during the Cold War on the East-West German border. So again, with the Soviet problem in a divided Europe. In the special operations world, and finally as a Russian foreign area officer. And in that area, I spent a lot of time, all over that part of the world. So I had 2 stints working at the embassy in Kyiv, Ukraine. I also had an embassy tour, 3 years in Estonia, 1 in Azerbaijan, did a lot of work in Georgia, and just traveled all over Russia as a START mission commander. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. I also had a unique opportunity back during the Kosovo conflict to deploy with and serve with a Russian airborne battalion in Kosovo for 5 months. So that was very high adventure, very interesting. After I retired, I started working in the consulting world and worked at my last part of that 10-year service in the consulting world was working at the wargaming lead for the Department of Defense. Their Secretary of Defense's office specifically focused on wargaming, the problem sets that we're looking at as it relates to Russia. So I've got a good deal of experience at the national level looking at this problem. And then taught at the university level, intelligence and security studies, and ended up at VOC, where I'm a senior fellow now, again, looking at Russia and the history of communism. So that's kind of me. So what we're going to talk about today is this conflict. So that's kind of my background, my my certificate of participation in all these different things that's going to help us kind of understand this. So the title is, the war in Ukraine, really, and I call it Putin's war for a reason. We'll talk about why he invaded, where we are now, and how I think this might end. So the goal today is really to help you understand the war in Ukraine, but equally important, in my view, is understand Russia. In February of 22, we all know Russia invaded Ukraine in what was an illegitimate war of choice. According to most people, there's some, obviously in Russia, who think it was a war of survival for them. You have some in the West who sometimes parrot that line. But we're going to explore really the why of it. Why did Russia do this? Why the war on Ukraine? But I'll also say it's a war on the West as well, and help you understand that there really is no easy solution to this thing and how it's going to end. And no one is going to get everything they want. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get started.
So Ken, in terms of the slides, I think I've got it uploaded here. If we, for our audience, just pause a second. Yeah. Let's see if it's coming through. So do you see that now?
I see that, yeah.
Does that work for you, or do you want to go with your slide deck?
I'd like to go with what I had so I can control it. That'll be a little bit easier.
Yep. Then here we go. Hold on. And let me get you back to, there you go.
Okay. All right, good. Okay, so let's go ahead and advance this. All right, so as I mentioned in the intro, really one of the most important things that we can do in understanding this conflict is really to first kind of understand Russia and how Russians work. So we need to remember when we think about Russia and the Russian people, they're very different from us and they view the world very differently than we do. Surprisingly, even to this day, I find that most people who I have this conversation with, they really don't understand this fundamental fact. We Americans tend to mirror, or like I call mirroring, we project how we view the world, in this case, the conflict in Ukraine and any other geopolitical conflicts that we might have with Russia, the way we would view it, and assume the Russians sees that the same way, and that is not the case. They are very much different from us, and it's really not how this situation is going to work. For example, let's take this concept of Russian literature. You see on the screen there, you have the English, how they view some of these kind of meatier issues of life and death and what they view as worth fighting for. So you got the Brits who will die for honor, the French, of course, love, Americans for freedom. And what about our Russian friends? Well, if you could see the slide, it would say, we will die, which is basically their answer to about everything. So it's really a understanding of that kind of dark humor, but also it's kind of hits a key aspect of the Russian psyche, which at times is pretty dark, very pessimistic. And that psyche is really there for a reason, because it's shaped by centuries of hardship, invasion, terror from foreign invaders, but far too often, and most often, sadly, is brutality from their own totalitarian leaders. And that's what we really have to understand as we start looking at these people. They've been scarred and they view the world a specific way for a very specific and justified reason.
Hey, Ken, I love your slide deck. So let me just for a second see if I can't get us back to your slide deck. And I know it would involve me. Yeah, no, it looks like. All right. I'm going to go back to, hold on one second. How's that?
That's better. So
I've got it now. I've got it from my back end. So you, sadly for you and our audience, you're going to have to tell me kind of when to go forward, but I think I can understand, and I'll try to match your tempo here.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so go ahead and go to the next build then. So there you go. Okay. So again, these differences in the culture kind of manifest themselves across their society. So I'm going to give you an example that I saw up close and personal when I was still in the military traveling in Russia. So you see this image of this big Russian missile system. It's called SS-27. You see that on the screen. Now, it's very capable. It delivers this nuclear warhead at a range of about 7,000 miles, targeted, you can imagine where, probably somewhere in the US. Hits accuracy is about 200 meters, so it's very good, manned by their best troop, their strategic rocket forces. But the interesting thing is, as I was out doing this first inspection of this facility, is you see the missile, when we were doing this particular inspection, really all we were entitled to look at as part of the START treaty was the missile itself on that transport. What we were not allowed to look at was what's inside the garage behind it. So we were there, particularly rainy, windy, very windy day. And when we would do these inspections and we have reciprocal visits back to the States, you would see all the signage in any building covered up because they didn't want us to see what they had and, anything that gave us any indication about their routines or how they do business. So we went in, we saw this one sign down, and you see that text in red in Russian. And if you speak Russian, you'll understand what that sign says. And what it says is, warning, do not drink the wiper fluid. Now, think about that for a second. You have a country that can do the R&D, the development, the training, produce this in system, train their guys to use it, and hit a target out to 7,000 miles. But you got to tell the guy with his little bony finger on the red button to launch that thing probably our way, don't drink wiper fluid. So there's really something pretty interesting there in that story. There's something that is wrong or something's amiss in this system. And in order to understand Russia, you need to kind of do that level of exploration of what is wrong with the system, what am I seeing? So it's kind of indicative to some degree about Russia, where everything there almost works. And you see that kind of throughout. There's a lot of fundamental flaws in their society, especially in their government. And it shows us that the people in the country there are very different from us. And we fail to understand that what makes them tick kind of at our own peril as we're seeing this particular conflict. So let's go to the next slide, Jen.
All right.
Okay, so you got this. Okay, talk about Russia and the Russian people. So Russia, again, obviously a very huge country. You can see the U.S. fits in there kind of nicely with a lot of room left over. So it's massive. So it's vast. It's compared to the U.S. It's you can put the next piece up, Jen. It's a beautiful country. I've traveled all over from, you look all the way over to the west near St. Petersburg, up into the Arctic area, through Central Asia, all the way out to the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Far East. So just really interesting people. I kind of look at the Russia and Russian people in two separate bins, the Russian people, and then you got the Russian rulers and the Russian elite. So let's talk about the people first. I really do love the Russian people. They're really some of the easiest people you could ever want to meet to get along. You have a meal with a Russian or have a vodka shot or two with those guys, and you're going to have a lifelong friend. That's kind of different than a lot of the Western Europeans that I've dealt with over my time in that part of the world. They have a great culture in the arts and literature, but Russia, and again, Russians are very different from the West, are not like us. They view the world very, very differently. They are very pessimistic. They're very untrusting of Westerners, in particular, foreigners, and they have this ongoing fear of being persecuted, rightly for a number of good reasons. And again, we fail to understand that as part of their psyche. That love, however, does not extend to those in power, the ruling elite or the Russian government. I loathe the Russian government and the Soviet government before it. In Russia, those in power, you can pick your totalitarian leader. You got a Lenin or a Stalin or Brezhnev or Putin. They all want to be the same thing, the world's great power at virtually any cost, as history has demonstrated repeatedly with these guys. But they can't seem to get there due to their priorities and their ambitions. They don't have the capacity to make it all happen. And that part of the problem is you got the system designed to keep the totalitarian ruler in power, corruption, disparity, and again, what they're able to do and what they want to do. And they're willing to brutalize their own people, their neighbors, to gain and maintain power. So despite their desire to be this great power, they really can't seem to get there for a few reasons that we'll discuss as we go on a little bit farther into the briefing. That problem really seems to prompt their rulers repeatedly throughout their history to act illegitimately to achieve their desires. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So go ahead, one more, Bill. Okay, so if you think about the question, so why did Russia invade? So is it our fault? Or is it just a Russian waste? So you hear a lot of these questions when I get this. Well, isn't it the West or the Russia or US's fault? NATO expanded, left Putin no choice. I think there's the answer there to that question is yes and no, but perhaps not for the reasons you think. I really tend to agree with historian Stephen Koken, and based on my own experiences, probably I guess around 35 years worth now at this point of dealing with Russia and the Russian people and the Russian leadership. It assumes that if NATO and the EU didn't exist or had expanded, Russia would be any different than it is today. I just don't think history really supports that idea. The pattern of rule there hasn't changed much since the first Tsar, that handsome fellow to the left, Ivan the Terrible. Long before NATO was even an idea. I would always tell friends who would ask about Russia, they'd say, what's changed in Russia? And I'd tell them, really nothing's changed in Russia, not since the collapse of communism, but since the first Russian Tsar. It's always been ruled, by these strong people, these strong authoritarian leaders. It was repressive. It was militant. It was imperial, distrustful of the West and foreigners again. So really not so much a response to the West, but who they are as a people and a culture controlled by authoritarian or totalitarian leaders. And that's really kind of, you look at the people, their preference. If you look at that one image there, the one of Stalin on a little sign, that's very similar to a photo I took back in the early 2000s during protests in Kyiv, where I would see some of the elderly folks protesting about the loss of their pensions, carrying signs of Stalin around saying, "We want our Stalin back." Think about that. That's kind of in that culture. Then if you go to the next bill, Jen, you got our guy now, Vladimir Putin, who sees himself in the same kind of light, sees himself as this great leader. So really, again, I think what best summarize, kind of Russia in its way is if you look at, if you go ahead and build the last bit of that slide out, Jim, is you've got this Russian proverb, and I think it really kind of says it all. It said the wolf may lose its pelt, but never its nature. So I really think Kotkin was onto something when he said this is kind of the history of Russia. So let's go to the next slide. So some people say, it's NATO encroachment. Well, I'll say, yeah, it kind of is. So if you look at the NATO layout during the Cold War, that map there to your left, and go ahead and build out the next piece, Jen, compared to what it is today. So yeah, NATO did increase. It increased quite a bit. It went from a small number of nations up to the point where we have 32 NATO nations today. NATO nations, including Finland and Sweden, something that nobody probably could have imagined prior to the war in Ukraine. So if you look at it from their perspective, yeah, you can make the argument that we did kind of inch forward into pretty much right up on their doorstep, which is something, way back when in the early 90s, Baker said that would not happen. But why did it happen? It was not really because of NATO expansion, the way this war is taking place. I really think that's kind of a convenient excuse for all the woes and maladies of first the Soviet Union and now Russia today. It's always somebody else's fault. They would always have some outside boogeyman to blame their woes on. So, but these countries that joined NATO, they did it for a reason. East and Central European countries, and even more so these former Soviet republics, they want no part of Russia for the very reasons we discussed and more that we're going to talk about a little bit later. They distrust, they fear, in many cases, they loathe Russia due to their own experiences with these guys. The guy's in charge since 1917. And that's why they desperately wanted it to be in NATO, mainly not so much relying on the NATO allies, but mainly focused on one key NATO partner, and that's the U.S. They viewed the U.S. as their guarantor of security, and that's why they wanted to be part of the club. So it really is a shield against the Soviet Union, now Russia today, and especially with Putin for the last 25 years. So we'll discuss a little bit more of this as we go forward. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Jen. Okay, so part of the problem for us in the West is that we really fail to understand Russian rulers. And for the last 30 years, I'll submit to you that we've in the main got it wrong with these guys. I think the best indicator of the rationale of why they went in for this conflict rests with the leaders themselves, the Russian rulers, and frankly, some very weak Western leaders. It's really about Russia's authoritarian and totalitarian rulers and how they think and they operate. They understand and respect one thing and one thing only, and that's power. And they wield it mercilessly on their own nations and against their own neighbors. They tend to view those unwilling to use their power as weak, especially superpowers who have it and they won't use it. And that weakness they view as one thing, and that one thing is opportunity. And I think we've seen that play out over the course of the last 20-some years. So I think when Putin looked at the West, when he came to power in early 2000, he saw the West was eager to maintain peace at any cost. It was slashing its military expenditures across the board, increasingly reliant on his oil and gas. We'll talk about more of that later. And he saw the EU and the US weakly led and militarily on a very, very sharp decline. And think about everything else he saw too. So with every provocation or troop increase on Ukrainians' border, we'll start with that conflict first, leading up to the war, we in the US and especially our European allies, we did really nothing, virtually nothing. And we have a rather lengthy history of doing nothing when it comes to his aggression. So think about it. When you do nothing, when Russia conducts massive cyber attacks in Estonia in 2007, literally shuts that country down for about a month, to include the US embassy, was offline for a month. He murders his political opponents across, Western Europe, UK, Spain, other places. When we ignore the Georgian invasion of 2008, where he again annexed portions of that country, then he invades the Donbass area, the republics to the east in Ukraine, and annexes Crimea in 2014. And then he finally invades Ukraine proper in 2022 And the best we can do in virtually every one of these cases is kind of weakly chastise Putin. So if you think about the things we heard some of our political leaders say, and so we'll just stay with the U.S. and trust me, the European leaders were no better, probably in a lot of cases a lot worse. But you look at Biden, the first picture, you got Biden says don't, he says don't when he's getting ready to go into Ukraine. So that really not very helpful. We can't provoke him and bring the U.S. into the war with Russia. That was kind of the mantra of his administration for a while as well. We'll skip over Trump for a moment. We'll get back to him in a minute. Let's go ahead and build one more, Jen. So then you had the Obama, this infamous meeting that he had with Medvedev in South Korea. And he was caught on open mic telling Medvedev to please tell Vlad that I need some space. And then after the election, I'll be able to work with him. And what he was talking about working with him on was this missile defense deal that we were working with the Czech Republic and Poland. And 2 years later, when he's reelected, he promptly cancels that missile defense agreement with those two nations, something they would probably like to have back right now. And then 2 years later, Vlad repays Obama by doing what? By taking Crimea. And think about what Obama said then. The only thing that we did was tell Putin, you're on the wrong side of history, which really, if you think about it, a very silly statement. Pretty much every border in Europe has been decided and divided and set by some type of conflict or war. And then you go to the next build. Then you have George W. Bush's famous statement, I looked into his soul, or saw into his soul, and I can trust him. And likewise, a couple years later, what happens? Putin invades Ukraine, also does a cyber attack in Estonia. So again, you got all these statements. We don't want to provoke him. Really, to those guys, that is a provocation. That most assuredly is going to provoke him to take some type of action and then probably take more. I'm relatively sure that all these kind of silly statements that some of our leaders have made, both here in the U.S. and Europe, got a pretty good chuckle by Vladimir and his inner circle. You think about what he's thinking. So that's it. That's all it's going to cost me. It tells him one thing. It says these guys are afraid of me, and when they sense fear, or when we only react weakly, if even at all, we're losing to him. Period. So you pick your kind of domain: the military, the information space, cyber, diplomatic, economic. We really see too much to him, much too often, and far too early. And as a result, his appetite grows. So let's do the last build on that slide, Jim. So Trump. So this picture is from summer of 2018, but I want to do is step back to February of that year of 2018. So we've heard these things now. Trump is being scammed by Putin. He's going to get this bad deal. He's kind of a Putin puppet and all those things. So is that really true? So again, all these things are kind of nuanced. I don't think any of this is true for any of these leaders, but let's just talk about what happened in 2018 and the message that Trump sent Putin that he really understood. So in 2018, in Syria, there was a small U.S. Special Forces team and a few Marines that were working with their Syrian, allies who were trying to overthrow the Assad regime, and some Kurds as well. And they were at this refinery, very small force. Approaching them very rapidly was a very large tank force with multiple tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and we knew for certain due to the intel that those were Russian Wagner mercenaries, probably up 500 to 700 of those guys, along with their Syrian counterparts. So Trump ordered Mattis, the Secretary of Defense at the time, to call his counterpart in Moscow and say, hey, we see you guys coming. We have both sets of forces there, Russian and US, and told them we need to get that fixed and to stop that. Russian denied it, said it wasn't their guys, and Trump ordered the destruction of that force. So that's exactly what they did. For 45 minutes, they pounded that organization into really oblivion. And it was very interesting. We got the readout of some of the Wagner radio traffic post battle. And I'll just read a couple things about what they said and kind of the message they got at the end. And this is one of the Wagner guys, one of the commanders. Well, to make it short, we had our asses effing kicked. So one squadron effing lost over 200 people right away. Another lost 10 people. I don't even know what happened to the third squadron, but it got torn up badly too. So 3 squadrons took a beating. And then he continues saying this: they beat our asses like we were little pieces of shit, but our effing government will go into reverse now. Nobody will respond or do anything. Nobody will punish anyone for this. So these are our casualties. So that, I submit to you, is a message that Putin will understand. And he did, because nothing else happened during that first administration. Doesn't mean nothing will happen this time around. Jury's out still to be seen how any type of negotiation goes with these guys. But that, I will tell you, is the only message that these type of leaders understand in that country. They understand power, and they understand a firm punch to the forehead. Anything less than that, they're going to push and continue to push hard. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Next piece of it too, Jim. Okay, so what do we have here? So we have the Russia way, is what I would call it. So you got these authoritarian leaders who's in a totalitarian state. I think really, you could probably say that Russia today is really a totalitarian state. Some will argue authoritarian. I think it's kind of a very minor difference in this case. So what do we have? So you have this authoritarian ruler kept in power by not the oligarchs that so many people seem to think, but really the power ministries, not the oligarchs. It's mainly intel and former security service guys that are in his inner circle. You think about the size of these organizations. So you got the FSB, the Internal Security Service, the replacement for the KGB, over 250,000 people in that, we think. That's nothing like our intelligence services in the US, infinitely larger. You got the SRB, this Foreign Intelligence Services. You got this National Guard. Think of it really as Putin's Praetorian Guard of 400,000 people. And then plus all the military and everything, but whose primary mission is to keep that one guy at the top in power. And that in a population of about 145 million people. So that's a lot of security folks designed to do one thing: keep the guys at the top on the top. So the people who run these services are Putin's, kind of handpicked cronies. And these are the guys he trusts because he came out of the same world as they did. Remember, he was a former KGB guy. So they in turn rely on him for power, for position, and Putin's checkbook, which really is, if you think about the Russian economy, they take and they steal and they take what they want. So you look at this picture that you see of the guys. They've been the same ones from the start of the war, and the faces really haven't changed that much, with the exception of that guy with the red X, the Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was the former Wagner commander who tried a coup driving to Moscow. Pretty stupid decision. Even stupider was once he was supposedly forgiven by Putin, voluntarily went back and then mysteriously died in a plane crash shortly after he got back in country. How he was repaid. So the intelligence community, both old and new there, really controls or has significant influence over pretty much all of the government and private enterprise. So he's populated even the regional outlying republics or governor positions with former KGB or FSB guys. So he uses these former intel officers at the beginning too to take over the bulk of these economic enterprises across the country from some of those oligarchs who originally had it, just not his guys, not his oligarchs. Most importantly, they control the energy sector. So if you think about today, 3 out of 4 senior government officials are current or former intelligence officers. 40% of the Russian bureaucracy and about 60% of his administration have some type of intel or security background. So he is the guy in charge. Make no mistake about that. I thought maybe there was some people who had some influence over him, but I think I lost that notion when I saw what happened in the lead up right before the war on Russian TV, where you had Putin really browbeat this guy, his security chief, Sergei Narishkin, into submission on TV about the Russian invasion. You could see the intel chief was kind of hesitant about whether he should say, yes, we should do that or not. Putin kind of browbeat him into submission and got him to say that he should. So when I saw that, I think something's changed. He decided he's not interested anymore in what his intel guys thinks. And really, that was kind of a recipe for the disaster that the initial invasion was going to prove to be. So that, again, is the type of world that he's living in and the one he's created for himself. So let's go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about Putin and how he came to be the guy he is today. So his formative years was, of course, in the Soviet Union. And what was that world characterized by? And really, it was a world of violence. That's the world he came out of. And I think Sorokin, really, this author, playwright, just a great writer, The quote is so good, you almost want to read it all the time. So as a child, I perceived violence as a sort of natural law, and the totalitarian Soviet Union oppression held everything together. It was a sinister energy of our country, and it really was. That was how that country operated. It still does to some degree today now. If you look at the next build, Jen, please. You have the great Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and let's look at what he said. And I think this is really indicative of what the nature of play is in Russia and what's kind of driven him. Though Russia is not a communist nation today, they still use all the tools that previous regime used. I think the key point is Lenin's teaching. Says, and that teaching is this, that anyone who doesn't take what's lying in front of him is a fool. And really going back to what happened with the Trump administration the first time was that communist leaders respect firmness and have only contempt for people who continually give in to them. And that has been the biggest weakness and biggest mistake of Western leaders writ large for 30 some years in dealing with Russia. They will not do the hard thing of standing up to them. And typically, if you do, you get a better outcome. So let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about Putin, the guy, and his journey. So he grew up in poverty. This guy was not part of the system originally. So starts off kind of shaped by this harsh, cruel world that he's in now. I gained a little bit more insight about him personally when I was on a panel with a lady who actually grew up in the same apartment building with him and went to high school with this guy. So when she, they both lived in this apartment building in Leningrad that was just abysmal, very, very poor. If you look at Putin's autobiography, he talks about that life in that apartment building, fighting rats, and how it just left a mark on this guy. So when my friend knew him, she said that she thought him kind of a true believer in the Soviet Union, communism, while her family, they were Jewish, they were dissidents, and they were being really kind of oppressed by the regime. But Putin's a little bit different. So at last, he climbs out of this poverty that most people can't escape and becomes part of the elite of the Soviet Union. He becomes a KGB officer. And that tells us a couple things about this guy. So number one, that tells us that he's trusted and that he's one of them. He's one of the party. He's part of the team now, part of the KGB, part of the Soviet Union. He's an elite. He's allowed a foreign posting, and as fate would have it, he goes to East Germany. Now, an interesting posting that kind of leaves a mark on this guy. If you think about East Germany and where he was working, who he was working with the Stasi, the state police, security police there. Talk about the level of paranoia there. So the Stasi employed one full-time security officer for every 180 East Germans. Think about that ratio. Even in the Soviet Union, the ratio was 1 to 583. So he has swam in kind of the sea of paranoia in surveillance state in that country. That paranoia kind of proved to be warranted because the whole thing collapsed while he was there. So that left a mark on him. He saw his world. He was somebody. He was the KGB guy, part of the party, part of the team, and now that whole world's collapsed. And we've heard many, many times now how he's lamented the collapse of the Soviet Union, called it the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And he's determined to not let that happen to Russia. And he seems determined also to kind of rebuild part of this empire again, back to its former glory. So let's go to the next slide. So why did he invade? So again, part of this, maybe this quest for this new empire, he wants to be this new great man in the mold of a Peter the Great or Stalin, this man of steel who kind of led the Soviet Union at its zenith of power. And he wants to create this semblance of this greatness and empire, but in order to have that, he needs a buffer between him and the West, which he distrusts. Think about what he doesn't want to have on his border. On his western border is a democratic Ukraine. On his border, he sees that as a threat to his rule. Not so much that Ukraine's going to attack, but I think part of it is you have a democratic, flourishing country to your west that your people go into to visit, and they come back and they wonder, why don't we have that? And he thinks that could, eventually perhaps lead to toppling his regime, and he's going to prevent that. He also thought too, I believe, when he was looking at Kyiv, that he sees these as like a national or natural ally, like the Belarusians, the Slavics, the Slavic people coming together again. I think he also noticed when East Germany collapsed, the two sides, the East and West, were hugging each other in the streets when the country was moving toward reunification. Maybe in his mind, he thought that might happen again. He was going to reunite the Slavic people together. Clearly, that didn't pan out too well for him. So I think that's where part of the rationale, he wants this new empire. If you go to the next slide. Okay, let's just start there. So what you have here is Putin. So if you look at it from his perspective, a couple of things start to make sense to him, I think. In my view, he went into Ukraine because really everything seemed to align for him. He wants to create this empire. He needs Belarus, he needs Ukraine, he needs territory, and he has this tradition of expansion. But what does he see if you look in Ukraine? So Putin, when he looks at Zelensky, what does he see? He sees this really very unpopular Jewish actor, comedian turned president who's not doing well in his own country. And he thinks if he drops a bomb or sends troops that way, that guy's going to bug out and run for the hills as soon as he starts the invasion. In Europe, what does he see? He sees, Western Europe kind of completely dependent on Russian energy. After years of Russian paid and supported green initiatives and protests designed to move the EU off nuclear and coal. And that worked beyond his wildest imaginations, especially in Germany. He sees, the West, very, very divided about defense. They're really not spending a lot of money on it. He looks at, if you go to the next build, Jen, he looks at their defense capability as really completely gone. And this is the German army commander, what should have been and what has traditionally has been during the Cold War, one of the strongest NATO members besides the US. And this is what this man says. In his 41st year, the army that I'm allowed to lead is more or less standing buried. He couldn't be more right. This army used to be a 600,000 man lethal fighting force. Today, even today, after all the promises to make it better, still 62,000 guys in uniform in the army. And virtually nothing else works. You got a Navy that can't fly without scavenging. Navy can't sail without scavenging parts from other ships. Air Force kind of the same way. So he felt the timing was right, and I think that's part of his calculus, and I think that's why he acted when he did. So let's talk about how he gauged that. So let's go to the next slide. So how goes this war? So first of all, it seems Putin really underestimated the Ukrainian will to fight, and Zelensky. Personally, he turned out to be a pretty remarkable wartime leader and has modeled a great deal of courage for his people. He didn't run when he was offered a ride. Sad to say, he offered it from us. He turned it down, wanted weapons, and he stayed there. He was, again, polling at about 32% in November of 2021. A few months into that war, he was well north of 90%. Probably could have run for president in some of these European countries and won. He was that popular. The problem was that popularity and will to fight is not always enough. Putin found that out as well, too. So if you go to the next build, Putin didn't do very well when he sent his army in. So you had a lot of scenes of just like this where Russian forces were just annihilated on roads because their operational planning was flawed. Their tactical execution was even worse. They led in a lot of cases with conscripts against the Ukrainians, who really did some pretty smart things during the 8 years between losing Crimea and fighting in the Donbass up until 2022 when Russia proper invaded. They rotated about 400,000 soldiers through that Donbass fight. So you had battle-hardened troops with a lot of experience facing, in a lot of cases, Russian conscript soldiers who had no experience. And they paid a price for it. Plus, we have a lot of problem with Russian equipment. A lot of it's kind of fatally flawed. We can probably talk about that during some of the question and answer pieces. So let's go to the next slide. I think Putin really also underestimated the West. So go ahead and build that all the way out. I think maybe he was guilty of a little mirroring too. He thought that they would respond, the way his people would, or the way we typically have in the West. But I think Stephen Coaten, again, the historian, kind of nailed the difference this time. So the West is really a series of institutions and values, not geography. The West is about the rule of law, democracy, private property, open markets, respect for the individual, free speech, and all the freedoms that we enjoy and far too often take for granted. That's not Russia. And I think really when he did this invasion with some of the crimes he committed clearly there, it really offended most of the people in the West. I think it changed in some ways how they wanted to relate and view Russia going from that point forward. They were a little more willing to support, actually arming Ukraine for a change as opposed to what they've been doing in the past, which is mainly providing humanitarian efforts and everything else or aid to them. So again, He didn't read the West very well. And I was thinking, or we were hoping initially, that we saw a lot of encouraging signs early on where Germany says they're going to start contributing real money to their defense. Sadly, they really haven't lived up to that, even though they said they were going to give 110 billion. They never really got to that point, and they still really haven't. They've increased some, but not enough. Let's go to the next slide. I think Putin also overestimated himself and Russia and his own intelligence, his own diplomatic intelligence, his intelligence services, his military, diplomatic, and economic power. I think he really got a lot of that wrong. You can go ahead and build the rest of that out, Jim. I think one thing that really kind of let him down, and he let himself down as a former intelligence officer, he should have known better. The intel services in the West, they serve to protect the nation and their citizens, in most cases, mainly against external threats. In these totalitarian states like Russia, in particular Russia, the role for those services is regime survival, keeping that guy Putin in charge and his cronies. So the Russians and Soviets, all along, they have been great and amazing intel collectors, counter intel guys, subversives, great with propaganda and all that stuff. But what they were always weak on was analysis, because the answer really was already decided by the guy in charge. So they really didn't do a lot of thinking. They gave the boss the answer they wanted. And that really is a recipe for disaster. When his intel guy tried to warn him that maybe this thing might not go the way you were thinking it would when we go into Ukraine, he didn't listen. And that cost his country a great deal. And it's still costing them. So they made a mistake. His intel, his military, he made the mistake of understanding, maybe the enemy and maybe yourself. And he didn't get either one of those very correct. And I think he's paying the price for that. So let's go to the next slide. What the Ukrainians did differently, kind of alluded to that in a previous slide, was they really absorbed a lot of Western military training and a lot of weapons toward the latter part of 2019. So he got a lot wrong. The Ukrainian military got a lot right. Like we said earlier, they rotated a lot of guys in there. They absorbed a lot of training that in the past, I'll tell you, when I was first assigned there in the early 2000s, they really weren't interested in doing too much of it. They were willing to take some of the training, but it was really not to the level. And I think in a lot of cases, from what I saw, it wasn't taken too seriously. War changes things. So they learned those lessons the hard way. They've really done quite a good job. And they've learned a lot of key lessons that I think it's basically saved their country. It's not over yet, and I'm not really optimistic about their future, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think the good news is their military that they created saved them from what should have been, what everybody was anticipating would be a 3-day war ending in their defeat and the loss of their nation. So let's go to the next slide. And this is where we're going to spend a lot of our time now, is just talking about, where we are, who's winning, and what's the future hold. So looking at this map, I'm really not very optimistic about a solution anytime soon. So Putin seems to be willing and committed to winning this thing. So if you look at the map, the one to the left is from July of 2022. And if you look at the right, the one on the right, that is from today. And really the lines and the amount of territory occupied has not changed much. So we're kind of at this thing called stasis, where we're not having a great deal of movement or great gains on either side anytime soon. So time really, it works against both nations, obviously, but I think really for Russia, it's not as big a factor as it is for Ukraine. Ukraine has more to lose, and they're losing more every day, pieces of their territory, and it's not a promising thing, in a lot of different areas that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But again, not a whole lot has changed in almost 3 years of war on the front lines. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is key. We're going to spend some time on the next couple of slides talking about these particular issues. So if you look at this slide, what do you see is how much territory and what the losses are. So if you look at this, Russia now retains about 20% of Ukrainian territory. And if you look at the losses, military killed and wounded, those are the numbers, staggering numbers. We haven't seen numbers like that probably since World War II. Almost 1 million people on the Russian side, probably inching closer to that. Ukrainians, 400,000, but that's 3.1% of their military. And then you look at, this whole thing was, sanctions trying to stop Russia. You look at some of the things that we thought would be a little bit different. This graph kind of surprises me when you look at the fact that their GDP has actually grown 5.6% during this war. Meanwhile, Ukraine's has plummeted by 23%. And the other interesting piece is in both nations, the people, if you look at the polls, I mean, I know polling in Russia is problematic at best and probably not a whole lot better in Ukraine either. But at least if this poll is accurate, it shows that a majority of both countries are looking for some type of peace, or at least open to those type of negotiations. So again, these guys are paying huge prices in men lost, women lost, citizens lost, territory lost, and it shows no sign of abating anytime soon. So again, one thing that's really continuing are the human losses. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's start there. So this is where, we were talking on our podcast, Jen and I and a couple others, was about the debate and how we can talk about this conflict without, devolving into name calling. So I like to call it slogan slinging. But really the kind of the debate is, the way I see it is these two different things. The ideal view and the realist view. So in the idealistic view or idealism, if you think about international affairs, it's the way we'd like to see it to be. So, my preference, and I think a lot of people who look at this conflict, if I had my way, how would this end? Number one, Russia would be defeated. They would be out of Ukraine completely, to include Crimea. They would rebuild what they destroyed in Ukraine, and they would pay some type of price, either losing some territory or significant sanctions and monetary damages, if you will, back to the Ukrainian people, and the people who committed war crimes will be tried. That's idealism. That's not reality. And reality is probably none of that's going to happen the way we want it to be. Ukraine is probably going to end up losing territory, and probably the people who did some of the worst crimes are probably going to go unpunished. If history is any guide, it's not how we would like it, doesn't make it right, but that's just probably our reality. And we'll talk about why it's going to be that way as we go through the next couple of slides. But really, the kind of slogan slinging really isn't advancing the argument. It's taking us away from things that we really do need to talk about. Support Ukraine as long as it takes, or the only acceptable solution is a victory. Okay, that sounds great. It makes a great, campaign slogan, but it's virtually impossible. And then you have the other side, no more forever wars. We need a peace agreement now. Yeah. Okay, great. I would love to see that. I've been to war. As I was telling the folks on the last podcast, I've been the one being shot at, and I've been the one doing the killing. It is not fun. And it's kind of the worst thing that human beings do to each other. And there's a lot of this going on there. And it's a war at a level that we haven't seen in a very, very long time. But this agreement level, when it devolves to name calling, is unhelpful, and it really doesn't advance anywhere near a solution. Okay, let's build the next piece of that slide, Jen. So what that does is it keeps us from having conversations at the national level and within an alliance that we really need to have. And that's this: what is the U.S. role in this conflict? Do we have one? Is there one? What's it going to cost, and what's it going to look like? And then really a final honest accounting for NATO's significant and capability and capacity issues. They are not ready for the type of war they say they want to have victory in. Completely unprepared for it, and are making no significant moves to improve that at all. Despite what they claim in a lot of the nation's capitals over there, they are not really doing anything to move the needle. And it's just really a complete understanding of the risks and costs, lives and treasure. What's it going to cost to bring about this type of victory that some of us say we want? I think there needs to be an honest accounting for what that looks like. What's the math look like? How many thousands of people are we willing to lose? How much treasure are we willing to invest into that? And what's the risk of a broader conflict with Russia? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is kind of a little wordy slide, but I think it's important that we just kind of see some of the fundamental facts that I see it as I see it. So, and this is it. I mean, we got Russia controlling a good chunk of Ukrainian territory, and they got 600,000 troops in there committed to keeping it that way. So that's a big number of folks. Okay, and Ukrainians simply do not have the manpower on their own, the weapons or the supplies to eject that force. They just don't. And that's math, and that's reality. And we really, as an organization, the defense organization of NATO, if we were serious about helping Ukraine, we failed them because we did not organize and arm them. And that's two things that are really important: organize and arm them to help have a better chance of winning, or at least repelling their invasion. We didn't do the good job on that before the thing went boom. And that's a mistake on us. And we had 8 years of warning from 14 until 2022. We knew that guy wasn't going to change, and we knew this was probably coming. And we collectively, as a defense alliance, sat on our hands and did nothing. And individual NATO members, despite what they say, because they're polling poorly in their home nations, they do not have the political will, the public support, or the capacity to push Russia out. That's a huge lift. And I don't see anybody willing to do that in Europe. Okay, let's go to the next bill, Jen. And this is part of the reason why we're going to take a look at this in a little bit more detail as we go forward. It's really their rhetoric is divorced from reality, and their rhetoric is divorced from their actions as well. So this is what is infuriating to me as somebody who's been in NATO pretty much all my military career, lived overseas away from my family in NATO for 11 years. And this is what I'm getting. I got Europeans telling us that we have to win, you have to support, yet they're buying $20 billion worth of Russia oil and gas and only giving Ukraine $19 billion in aid 3 years into the war last year. 3 years into the war. And they're still buying Russian oil and gas. If you look at the Russian defense budget of about $100 billion, 20 billion, 22 billion, what does that look like? That's about a quarter of their defense budget that the Europeans are providing them. Unacceptable. Okay, and no nation, despite all the tough talk, nobody's really offered to put troops in there to kind of eject the Russian forces. So how do we get there if the goal is total victory, if we're not willing somebody to commit to that? And our allies are focusing on the wrong things. True, some nations are spending more money on it, but they're not spending it on things that they really need. This war is an infantry-heavy war. They need soldiers. And none of these nations are increasing their troop strengths, not any that I've seen, in any substantial manner. In fact, the Brits, I think I just read an article recently, are still talking about cutting troop strength. So again, Starmer saying, we're in to help you win. His actions are divorced from reality. And then the Europeans are going to have to make some very, very, very difficult decisions with their people. And I don't think they've really thought this through yet. So if you think about, I was talking about this on the podcast with our colleagues, is that, Europeans, I love them. I spent a lot of my life living with them overseas, and some of my best friends are Europeans. But, they typically would kind of look down their nose at some of how we live our lives sometimes. You guys work too much. We work 35 hours a week. We take 6 weeks of paid vacation. We get free healthcare. We get free, education. You guys work too much. You don't take enough vacation. Well, yeah, we don't, because we've been paying for your defense for the last 40 years. And now the bill's coming due for these guys, and they're going to have to make some very, very hard choices with their population. I'm not sure so the people are going to be willing to do that. And they have to pay more taxes when they're already taxed at an incredible rate. So some of these social programs have to be cut. They're going to have to increase taxes. They're going to have to go into debt, which they don't want to do either. So again, I don't see how they're going to make that. They're going to level all this stuff out to where they can do the things they say they want to do to make this war go the way they want it. Let's go to the next slide. And this kind of tells it the tale of the tape, if you will. So again, it starts in 2014. So we know what happened in 2014. Russia invades, take and annex a large portion after doing all the other things we talked about. And you still only have 3 nations meeting the bare minimum in 2014 to honor their commitment to the alliance. 3 nations. Okay. It only gets a little bit better. 2 more nations join. And then in 17, they start dropping off. And then Trump comes in, kind of points his finger at them. That lasts for a while, and then it drops off again. It goes down to 6. Okay. And then we have the invasion, and then it trickles up a little bit until, 2 years into the war in 23, you still have only 10 nations doing the bare minimum to meet the NATO entry standards. And finally, in 24, they get to 23. And you can see kind of, who those folks were who were not really paying their fair share, so to speak. But again, I will submit to you that the 2% is wholly inadequate for the type of war that we're talking about. And we're going to look at those numbers, and I'll try to explain why as we go through that. So let's go to the next slide, Jen. Okay, so this is a war that is unlike anything we've seen since really probably the first Gulf War, and then probably before that, World War II. So it is a large scale, high intensity combat. And if you look at the numbers, the first build, Ukraine, each month, if on average, they have lost 11,000 soldiers killed and wounded each month, 100 tanks, 5 aircraft, and they're shooting 7,000 rounds of artillery a day, or 2.5 million annually. Go to the next slide. Russia, 20,000 soldiers killed or wounded each month, 300 some tanks, 9 aircraft, and they're shooting 10,000 rounds of artillery a day, 3.6 million. And if you build, they got 600,000 troops again in Ukraine. If you go the next build, that's some of the key NATO nations right now, where their standing army looks like today. The UK, again, one of the nations who came out loud about Ukraine must win, 62,000 soldiers, and they're talking about reducing that. 227 tanks. Germany, the same thing. France, a little bit more. The nations making some of the biggest noise about what we should do, also whose political leaders are pretty unpopular right now, making the biggest noise, but yet contributing probably nothing that's going to change the nature of this fight. The British Army going by the same numbers, is probably going to last 3 months in Ukraine. That's all the troops they have. And their equipment will last not much longer. Even combined, if you could get them to do that, it's not gonna work well. If you go to the next build out, Jen. That's what EU total produces in artillery rounds a year. Now look again what they're shooting over there. That does not build like a lot of confidence in our ability to win this thing. And I want to read some information that the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Chris Cavoli, one of my classmates from Command and Staff College, this is how he described the situation over there right now. Said Russian ground forces in Ukraine, this is a quote from his testimony from Congress, Russian ground forces in Ukraine have lost an estimated 3,000 tanks, 9,000 armored vehicles, 13,000 artillery systems, 400 air defense missile systems in the past year. Okay, that's just 1 year. And Moscow, he said, is on pace to replace those systems, added in noting that it's expanded its industrial production, opened new manufacturing facilities, converted commercial production for military purposes. That to me is kind of signaling, I'm in this to win it. Okay, as a result, he continues, Russian defense industrial base is expected to roll out 1,500 tanks, 3,000 armored vehicles, 200 Iskander ballistic missiles this year. Comparatively, the U.S. only produces 135 tanks a year and no longer produces Bradley fighting vehicles. Additionally, we anticipate Russia to produce 250,000 artillery shells per month, which puts it on track to build a stockpile 3 times greater than the United States and European Union combined. So those are the numbers, that's the math. And that's, again, where NATO as a whole is let itself down, and clearly the nation of Ukraine has not really helped it that much. Let's go to the next slide. And again, this is the manpower numbers, and you can put the last piece up too, Jen. This is what Ukraine and Russia have. And again, look at the disparity. Available manpower. I just read an article today about Ukraine really, really struggling to bring more people in, and a lot of it's policy related. They have, typically our draft for the U.S., if we had one, would be from 18 on up. They refuse to lower it below 25, age of 25. So I'm not quite sure why they're doing that, but that limits the amount of available manpower to them. Plus, you have to remember too, 10 million people left that country when the war started. So a lot of that was manpower. So again, looking at the numbers over there compared to what we need in order to do this type of offensive. So you think about if you got 600,000 people, troops, Russian military in Ukraine, when you're doing an attack, usually, by, kind of NATO standards, if you will, the ratio to kick that type of force out will be 3 to 1. So what does that number add up to? A lot of people that you don't see those numbers replicated in the numbers there within NATO. So again, if we're going to do this thing, if total victory is something we say we really want and we're going to pursue, then something is going to have to give. And it's going to be a lot of giving to the military defense complex in Europe and the US to build a military that's really going to be capable of doing something in this conflict. Because right now, we really don't have it. And the numbers here just kind of tell the tale. Numbers aren't everything, clearly, but it's very important in this type of fight. And then our last slide, Jen. So this is this great debate again. The questions I think we should be answering both as an alliance in NATO, but also here in the U.S. For those who say we must have this victory, I think these are some fundamental questions. So who's going to commit the troops? So I don't think Ukraine has the manpower to do it. Not this type of war. So they're going to need some assistance. And the nations advocating for this approach, do they have the capacity? I think the numbers kind of tell us that nobody really in Europe does. If they don't have it now, when do they project to get it? And I can tell you, at the pace they're investing and the people they're bringing in their militaries, it will not happen in 10 years at this pace. And then kind of some other math that's really important. So how many lives are we willing to lose in this fight, willing to commit to this? That's important to know. As I was telling the group last time, when I was in Iraq doing missions or in other combat areas doing missions, I had to tell expected casualties I was going to face as a captain or a major or a colonel. Why should we expect less from our governments? We need to know before we go into these conflicts. I think if we knew the things we know now going into Iraq or Afghanistan, how we would leave those, I think people probably would have been a whole lot less willing to go into them to begin with. I think we need to make that. And we got to have the commitment of the last bullet there on the top. If we're going to go, then we ought to go and not try to go get a participation trophy, but go to win if we're going to go in. Otherwise, why are we doing it to begin with? And then let's do the last piece, Jen. All right. And then on the other side of the coin, for the peace piece. So if we're going to go the peace route, what we need to talk about as an alliance, what do we owe non-NATO nations? I mean, there's things we owe other people in the thing called humanity. So I think there is something to be said about that. The moral right that the NATO alliance brings Western values. I think that's important. But we got to decide what that's going to look like and who gets that. Everybody around the world or just certain nations. We got to figure that out. What security guarantees are we going to give Ukraine, if any? What are we going to give them if we go down the peace route? And then how are we going to get both sides to give up something? Because that's how it's going to have to be if you're going to go to a negotiated peace of any flavor. And are they going to be willing to do it? And what's feasible? And what happens if Russia violates the peace agreement? What are we going to do then? Who's going to do something about that? Again, so it's all these type of questions that we really need to explore and really get into before we start down this path of conflict again. So Jen, can you build the last piece out? Last two pieces. There you go. Okay. And I think this is kind of like where I'd like to close it. It's very, very easy to get in, start a war or become involved in one. It's very, very difficult to get out of one in a proper manner. And we haven't done this well really since World War II. And I'm not really optimistic that we're kind of set up to do it well this time if we take a little more confrontational path. So that's kind of my take on it. It's again open for conversation. There's probably some questions. I'll be glad to try to answer them to the best of my ability and see what we would how we'd like to take the conversation.
Thank you, Ken, and my apologies for the little bit of a lapse in the slides. So thank you for your patience. Anyone who wants to ask questions of Ken, feel free to type some comments into either YouTube or X. Ken, there are a few questions already, though. One of them is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm good.
Did I miss you? No? Okay. No. So, I mean, I think let's go to the Putin puppet as a question. So I think you did a really good job of explaining where we have kind of missed, when people who are saying that Putin is a puppet, we've missed some of the action that he's taken towards Russia that would suggest otherwise. Right. However, I think that what this war needs and what people are thinking that they want, or at least what they want, how they want the U.S. to show up, is as kind of the strong man,
Right.
and that does not seem to be how Trump is responding. And
Yeah.
so this is what I think where a lot of people are using the term Putin puppet. Can
Right.
you give a little more background or insight or context on that?
Well, I think it's really it's a label. It's a disparaging comment that really doesn't tell us much of anything, frankly. So it's do I think the guy is a Russian asset? No, no, I don't. I just think he's got a very different way of looking at the world and geopolitics. He's a business guy. I think he looks at the nations, other things that are kind of impacting his calculus too, is he's looking at the nation's bottom line, $36 trillion in debt. And we're continuing to send a lot of money and treasure into these conflicts. Like I said earlier, look at what's happened since World War II. We have not really finished a war. We've gone to a lot of them. We spend a lot of money and treasure in Korea and Vietnam, and Korea still there. We came out of Vietnam in a shameful manner. We did Iraq, and then we gave it back, and now it's an Iranian proxy. We went into Afghanistan. We left it in better condition for the Taliban than they could probably. They probably are just still scratching their head. How can any nation be as stupid as the Americans to leave us $80-some billion worth of military kit that we're now selling on the open market and funding other terrorist organizations? I think that's probably part of it. And I'll be honest with you, as somebody who had 5 years of deployments, these various little garden spots around the world, I'm infuriated by all this stuff. I'm infuriated by leaders who, well, let's go get the participation trophy. We got to go do something. And then we don't, you're going to go spend thousands of lives, but you're not going to win it. That to me is shameful as a nation. And we've done that too many times. I think he's probably looked at the American people too, that there is no stomach for doing this conflict in a direct way. In 2023, when this war was more popular in America than it is today, only 17% of the people in this nation wanted to have U.S. direct involvement in that conflict. 17%. That's not something that you can take the country forward in a war with. And so now it becomes a question of what does our support look like? How much do we want to provide to this? Like in investing or anything else you do, you're spending money on something. What is it making a difference? And I don't know that it really is. We're keeping Ukraine alive, which I think is important, but there's got to be more than that. I mean, Putin, I think, by the industry and what General Cavoli was saying, they're determined to win. Is the rest of the European alliance determined to win? And I don't think they are by the numbers they're putting toward their defense today. They're not. So then again, the burden again falls back on us. And I think I think Trump is tired of being the U.S., tired of the U.S. being the sucker paying for all this stuff, while the Europeans continue in year 3 of this conflict buying Russian oil. That would drive me nuts if I was a leader, American leader. I'm saying, why would I pay anything when you knuckleheads who are closer to this conflict than I am are still funding the guy you say you're afraid of and you want us to defeat for you? It makes no sense. So until they fix a lot of these fundamental issues with the alliance at large, I don't think that's going to change. So I think the puppet thing is just, it's a slogan. It means nothing. And I think it's really not helping the argument. The argument should be, NATO, when are you going to be serious about what you say is your biggest security concern?
Well, that brings me to the next question. We're out of time, but I think that this is an important question because the question is on NATO. And so, we heard you talk about how that NATO expansion could have been one of the reasons that Russia felt that it needed to push forward. But regardless of the NATO expansion, Ukraine was not except for in the past, it was not a Russian state. So what is it exactly that the Russians feel a threat from? What is it exactly that they're protecting that they feel the need to kind of revisit Soviet borders?
If you have I had many conversations like this over many vodka mules and stuff like that with Russians, because I would say the same thing. Honestly, guys, do you really think NATO's a threat? And the answer was no. They know it's not, but it makes for a great propaganda piece. So for Ukraine, I think the real key for that is, like I said earlier in my briefing, is they really don't want a truly free, independent, democratic nation on their border. I think that bothers him because he is not going to rule Russia that way. And whoever the next Putin is, and it's going to be somebody like a Putin that takes over, they're not going to want that either. So they want to have somebody they can control and keep a buffer between them and the West, mainly from having those ideas freely flowing inside their country.
But that begs the question of when does it stop, right? I mean, okay, let's just assume Ukraine capitulates. Well, next you've got Poland, the democratic kind. Like, when does that stop? I hear that as, you know, an acceptable argument, but they will always, as they continue to push forward, have a democratic country.
Right. I think it stops again when NATO as an alliance is willing to do what was done to Putin's troops in Syria in 2018. When he has a pretty good understanding, if I do that, I'm going to get punched in the mouth and it's going to hurt. And I'm probably not going to want to do it again. And until we as an alliance and whoever the next leader is after Trump, it's got to be consistent. You know, you can't have one guy who is going to punch him and then the next leader says, well, okay, don't. And that's all he does. He figures he's like anybody else. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that's where part of the disappointment with Trump is. And now, because of your explanation, we understand a little bit more. But, you know, we were looking for that punch in the mouth, right? And when it was kind of like, well, no, let's discuss peace. It was like, no, we wanted the punch in the mouth. And you don't understand the NATO dynamics and why that punch in the mouth, from Trump or from America really doesn't make sense without a NATO, support system. I think that's that very simplistic view is what they were looking for. Okay, well, let's do that. Let's be the one that does the punch in the mouth. But when you actually look at it pragmatically, that makes a little less sense. I think that's just that was kind of the strongman response that I think a lot of people were wanting from Trump.
Well, I think and this could be part of it too. Again, I'm not a mind reader. I don't think really anybody is. I mean, he has his own way of doing business. Well, I'm hoping as part of the calculus, and maybe this whole peace thing is that, make it clear to everybody that he's not going to change, Putin, that is, and then you can start taking harsher actions, because then that maybe will bring some of the U.S. population along. But just going in and doing it for the Europeans yet again, and having them not responsible for anything, I think that's wrong. If there's going to be anything that happens in Ukraine, it should be, a lot of financing ought to come out of Europe. A lot of troop peacekeepers, if they, France and UK have said, well, at least France said, we'll put some people on the ground there. That's great to say right now until it happens. And then just like Germany, where we're going to increase our budget by $110 billion, and they didn't do even a fraction of that. Mm-hmm. It's just, I think what Trump sees it, and frankly, I'm at the same point now, having suffered through some of this stuff and losing a lot of friends, is that I'm tired of hollow promises from our leaders, European leaders, about what they're going to do to win this war, and they don't. And all we do is end up spending a lot of treasure and killing a lot of people, both ours and the bad guys, and with nothing to show for it. Nothing to show for it. We got nothing to show for our Afghanistan thing at all. 20 years, thousands of lives, and trillions, probably $1 trillion. And we, again, left your enemy in better shape than when we started the war. And I think that's what that's what Trump is focusing on. I think he goes, he's tired of that. I know I am. I'm tired of seeing that. If you can convince me that we're going to go win this and we really make Russia pay and get them out of there, to actually, you're committed to achieving that ideal view, no matter what it takes. Again, we're talking like World War II stuff again. Total victory. That's a hard ask for people. I just don't think there's any stomach for that right now in our country, or especially in Europe. I think about this. Right. We take that path. Do we think Russia's just going to sit passively and not start launching missiles, probably into some NATO country, if NATO countries are attacking his forces? You start hitting air bases in London, or near London, or in Germany, or our bases, all over Europe. Do you think that will the people put up with that? I don't know that they will. For Ukraine, they might if it was just their nation being attacked, but for another country, I don't know that there's that stomach for that. But those are the type of things we need to figure out before we go down that path, and the peace side as well.
Well, and I think like your outline of NATO, where it's at, where it's committing funds or not, is really part of the missing puzzle piece that I don't think that we get in our American storyline around the issue very much. So thank you again for sharing your time and your insight, and thank you.
It's a tough one. I mean, I'll be honest. I have friends in Ukraine that I lost contact with after the war started. I don't know if they're alive or dead, and it bothers me. I want them to have their country, and I want them to be left alone. But we got to do some hard decision making here that we haven't shown ourselves willing to do for many years.
Well, to our audience, thank you very much. You can follow us on YouTube at IL Values or on X at IL Values. And keep in mind, too, that we are a 501c3 and we are wholly volunteer. So any consideration of donations so we can continue our programming is much appreciated. Ken, again, thank you so much. And have a good evening to everyone in our audience and yourself, Ken.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.